Good evening. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the Forum Fall Season. I first met Robert Sapolsky in 2018 when he came to the Forum to discuss his best-selling book, Behave, a now classic account of why humans do good and why they do bad. Now, in his new book, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will, Robert mounts a brilliant and in his inimitable way, delightful, full frontal assault on what he sees as the pleasant fantasy that there is some separate self telling our biology what to do. One by one, he tackles all the arguments for free will, exploring chaos, quantum physics, and philosophy. He applies the new understanding of life beyond free will to some of our most essential questions around punishment, morality, and living well together. Tonight, we're going to talk about his insight into free will, the monumental task of living our daily lives without believing in free will, and how that could make for a much more humane world. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, delighted to be here. I don't know if this is just sound or visual, but if visual by way of explanation, I am unexpectedly in a vehicle driving through Iowa just now, so it's all very strange to be here.
It is. Well, I'm so glad you're joining us. I enjoyed reading Determined so much. It just brought me back to remind me just what a compassionate and thoughtful person you are. I just think that's the thing that stands out the most for me is just how much you care about the situation that human beings are in. And I appreciated your philosophizing. William James writes that he writes that the statement, "I have the ability to choose freely the actions I take." He said that statement is not possible to establish by reason. So how do you define free will, and what are the primary reasons that you don't believe in it?
Well, I think probably the easiest thing is to start off with looking at how most people define free will and their intuitions about it, which leads them to conclude that there's plenty of free will. And one of the domains where that plays out most commonly is in a courtroom. A defendant is sitting there. Everyone has decided they know that the defendant did it. And at that point, there's essentially only three questions to ask. Did the person intend to do it? Did they have a good sense of what the consequences were likely to be? And did they know that they had alternative behaviors available to them? And if the answers to those are yes, as far as most people are concerned, that's it. There's culpability, there's responsibility, there's choice, there's free will. And from my standpoint, this is like trying to review a movie based on only seeing the last 3 minutes of it. Because what's missing is the critical question. Oh yeah, great, they intended to do that and they knew the consequences and they knew their alternatives. Where did that intent come from in the first place? And where intent in us, where our wishes, where our desires, where our willpower or lack thereof, where our temperaments, our characters, all of that come from, is by everything that happened beforehand that brought you to this moment. Every biological thing that made you who you are, over which you had no control, and biology's interaction with every bit of environment over which we had no control. And that's where we has arrived at with our intents, with our wishes and such.
But it was helpful to me too. You talk about just those different kinds of causal vectors, if you will. So you talk about just what happens in the minute where the person makes that decision. You talk about what was leading up to that in the day or days before that. What kind of formation they received over time, what their childhood was like, what their prenatal experience was like, what their culture and family background. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Just like all those different links in that chain that lead to that action.
Well, you look at some action and why did it happen? And the most logical thing to do is say, well, what just went on in the brain a second ago? Which part of the brain was active? Which part less so? And hooray, we've just figured out the answer as to why they did that. But then you have to ask, what in the environment just triggered that brain to do that. Is the person hungry, tired, euphoric, stressed, whatever? Because that's going to affect the functioning of the brain in that instant. But then you got to ask, what about the person's hormone levels this morning? Because that's going to have influenced how sensitive the brain is or isn't to that influence. And then you got to step further back. What were recent months like? Because if during that time there was severe trauma, if you found love, if you found God, any of those things will have changed the structure of your brain. And then, as you said, back to adolescence and childhood and fetal life, because a lot of how your brain decides how to go about being constructed is occurring in your fetal environment, and then back to your genes, and then back to your culture. And what is critical is this is not a Swiss cheese model where you say, well, endocrinology, the hormones, that explains some stuff, but it can't explain this thing. To which you say, aha, but fortunately early development explains that thing, but it can't explain this other thing, but aha, fortunately cultural anthropology and so on. It's not that you need to take all of these different disciplines into account. They are all ultimately one discipline, which is to say that if you're talking about genetics, by definition, you're talking about the evolution of your genes. Oh, that's much better. Okay, sorry. Sorry to the audience. If you're talking about genetics, by definition, you're talking about the evolution of those genes. And you're also talking about early childhood experience that caused epigenetic programming of those genes. And you're also talking about the proteins that those genes specified for 20 minutes ago in your brain. In other words, it all becomes this one continuous arc of biological effects interacting with environmental effects over which we had no control. And when you look at this arc, there's no place to fit in everyone's conventional sense of free will, because it requires invoking things that don't fit with biology.
Right. I wonder, one of the things you mentioned in the book, and it's almost like an offhand remark, it's later in the book, you talk a little bit about your personal history with this kind of long-term belief that there is no free will. I wonder if you can just talk about, when it first occurred to you and just, how it's shaped, the decisions that you've made, that large belief that there's no free will.
Well, I was actually 14 when I decided there's no free will whatsoever. I was going through an adolescent angsty period, of course, and not getting much progress in making sense of all the things that were striking me as mutually contradictory about the nature of life and humans and motivation and purpose and meaning and all of that stuff. And that was clearly sort of stressing me. And one night I woke up at 2 a.m. with this epiphany, so to speak, of saying, oh, I get it. We're just biological machines. That's what's going on. And there's no meaning. There's no higher meaning to this. And I know you and I have talked about this already, so forgive me by tromping through this, of saying, oh, and there's no God. That's what's going on. That explains everything. And since then, I believe there's no free will at all. I think of us as being insanely complicated biological machines, but built of the same building blocks as a brine shrimp or a wildebeest or anything else out there, with some special features making us human. And from that moment on, it has seemed completely intellectually clear that praise and blame and punishment and reward and feeling entitled to anything whatsoever is completely intellectually bankrupt. So I've thought that ever since then, and about once every 4 months or so, I'm capable of actually functioning that way, because It's really hard It's really so. Most of the time, I'm just a flaming hypocrite with a conclusion that, we're nothing more or less than the sum of our biology. And then someone does something and I get infuriated at them and I completely forget the fact that they're nothing but the product of their biology. Or someone says to me, like, nice sweatshirt, and I feel briefly delighted with myself, even though that makes no sense whatsoever. So, yeah, this biologically has brought me to this point, but it sure is not easy to actually function that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, you described the goal of the book as being not to necessarily convince absolutely everybody that there's no free will, but at least to loosen our sense of that we got what we deserve. Whether that's people who are, the elites who got more than they deserve, but most often for the people who are suffering, who, may be suffering from some kind of illness, or who are struggling just to get by. That they're not responsible for the situation that they find themselves in.
Yeah, exactly, because, all things considered, we have a world here that runs on the notion that people can be treated better than average, or they could be treated worse than average, based on things about them that they had no control over.
Yeah.
And, this is a world in which most people are paying the price of a belief in free will.
Yeah. To what extent do you think it's possible to prove determinism? Is it a testable or provable hypothesis, or to what extent can we feel confident in our decision that there is no free will?
Well, here's where I become a total pain. In at least two different ways. The first one being, okay, what would it take for my money to prove that there is free will? And somebody does some behavior, and we've just identified, here's the 4 neurons that caused that to happen. And now we say, tell me, show me, prove to me that those 4 neurons would have done exactly the same thing no matter what the person's hormone levels were this morning, and no matter what their adolescence was like, and no matter which womb they wound up in for 9 months, and regardless of their genetic makeup and what culture they were raised in, and if they have a stomach ache at this moment, and show me that those 4 neurons would have done the exact same thing at the same time, and you've just proven that something just happened that is completely independent of prior influence. And as far as I'm concerned at that point, hooray, you've just proven there's free will. And it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I guess when I love that section. You said that you call it the challenge to the free willer to find those neurons that's fired spontaneously. And it seems to me like the challenge to the determinist would be to show the chain of events that can predict a kind of like non-trivial outcome. Do you mean like so? I mean, I know that determinism and predictability are different, but does it matter that it's determined if we can't ever know how it will be determined?
Yeah. So this is the big problem. Like, hooray, we know all this new stuff about science and the brain and all of that. And occasionally that's pretty good at explaining why something happened. And it's pretty lousy at predicting what is going to happen on an individual level. On a populational level, on a statistical level, it's actually not bad. So, for example, amid saying, okay, we don't know enough yet to run society on the premise that there's no free will, because we can't predict that well yet, and it's just trends, and like punishment still has its place, and meritocracy and all of that. But the answer is, we actually do know enough on a statistical level. For every increase in adversity in the childhood that you experienced, and there's all sorts of metrics for quantifying it, for every worst step of your childhood miserable luck, there's about a 35% increased chance that you're going to wind up involved in the criminal justice system at some point. And maybe flip the other way, for every wonderfully beneficial thing that's been happening to you in childhood, of your parents singing to you, or you're having music lessons, or you're feeling safe, or getting enough protein in your diet or whatever, there's a 35% increased chance that you're going to be sitting in my classroom at Stanford as a student there. It's when you look at those probabilistic things, we know enough already to know that the poor don't deserve to be poor, that the person who's umpteenth generation Brahmin ruling class did not earn their position in life. We know enough of that already. And even if you're going to have to wait another 10 years or another 100 years for us to learn enough neuroscience to be able to predict much more than on this vague populational level, we know already the world is run on people being rewarded and punished for things that were purely luck. And all that biology has done is show us the machinery by which, luck has produced those different sorts of outcomes.
Right. I thought a lot about this question. What kind of questions are questions that are appropriate for science and fit in that domain, and what are kinds of questions that are kind of beyond the limits of science, or that means of approaching an understanding of reality?
Well, I think my professorial answer, which makes sure that I don't actually answer the question, is that everything can be approached with science and a logical, fact-finding pursuit of what's going on, and the notion of falsifiability. You're willing to give up your advocacy of a certain viewpoint when data interrupt it. And all of that in the context that where that science and logic has to most be applied is to the ways in which we function illogically, and in nonlinear ways, and in which the pieces, the building blocks of emotion don't add up, and the ways in which we experience things that we don't have even words for. Yeah, so science is going to be very helpful in telling us how to think about the things that transcend science.
Yeah, I think of Immanuel Kant had this idea, had the Copernican revolution in his thought, and there really was a line that was beyond what we could think of. And I just wondered if there's a role for an idea like that, or mystery in your thought, or just, how you approach things that are just, one answer you gave is just you may not be able to predict an individual, but you can predict a population. But, how does mystery in those limits of our own thinking, how do you regard those?
Well, I think that taps into one of the sort of stereotypes of what science and scientists are like, which is they're little, unemotional, incapable of socially understanding human interactions or some such equivalent, and thus they're spending all their time looking at how atomic orbitals go about things. This sort of fleeing from feeling and emotion. And thus the purpose of science in that erroneous view is to cure us of mystery. And that's not the case in the slightest. What happens with science is every time science gives us an answer to some puzzle, it usually creates 10 more questions that are even more interesting. And the purpose of science is not to cure us of mystery, it's to constantly reinvent it and reinvigorate it.
Yeah, I guess my question is not so much about mystery. I guess it's just about what is unknowable. Just in the same question, the same way that I don't think we can come up with a scientific proof of determinism or non-determinism. I wonder what the limits of our knowledge are too.
Oh, there's all sorts of areas in which science has to be recognized. It's got no place to say anything. Years ago, I contributed an essay to some collection of what is it out there that you are completely convinced of but absolutely cannot be proven. And mine was that there's no God. Science has nothing to say about it. It can't prove it one way or the other. And I happen to be an atheist, not out of anything having to do with science or my knowledge of the brain or any such thing. Just emotionally, it doesn't work for me. But there's no way I can prove that, and that's a domain where science, better know it, has nothing definitive to say. So, yeah, there's lots of domains. Why does a particular chord in a particular Beethoven sonata give me goose flesh every time? That's not going to be, like, science isn't quite going to do that, let alone say why it gives me goose flesh and it doesn't give it to you, or the other way around. You know, science is good for a lot of stuff, but that's certainly domains that it can't get to.
Yeah. I definitely had the thought of just wondering just how artistic creativity is affected by this idea about free will. That was, and that's a good answer. Whether that is something kind of beyond, the question of free will, or whether or not free will is involved, it doesn't affect the power of that Beethoven sonata.
Yeah.
One of the things we try to. I love that the way you described it, just like having this idea about free will and just how hard it is to actually operate within that worldview. And I wonder if you can talk about the inconsistencies and conflicts that disbelieving in free will introduced into your life.
Well, as I said, I'm constantly being struck with my hypocrisy because I'm willing to be irritated with people, and I'm willing to feel proud of something, and I'm willing to have all sorts of things where I show I don't actually buy this. Let me give you an example of this. Like I've in recent years been working a lot with public defenders' offices on murder trials where there's an issue of like everything in this person's life, starting with like their first trimester, guaranteed that they were going to have a brain so pickled and corroded by all of their bad luck that at some critical juncture they're going to make a horrendous decision, and here they are sitting on trial for like life without parole. And where I come in, and my job is to try to like teach juries a bit about like, hey, if that was your history, you would have done the exact same thing too, and not because you're a rotten human. That's the sort of nervous system that your lifetime of experiences brought you to in that moment. And it's been interesting to me how that's been spectacularly unsuccessful at convincing juries of any of this. So I've been spending a lot of time doing that, and a while back there was one of these ghastly hate crime things. Somebody with an automatic weapon showed up in a place of worship and mowed down a bunch of people. It was beyond horrifying. And, listening to NPR that Monday, they were saying, the suspect in this appalling massacre was arraigned today, and it's actually going to be a federal hate crime, which makes him eligible for the death penalty. And I thought, yeah, fry him for doing that. I can't believe that he could have done. And then I think 2 seconds later, wait a second, I'm working on a death penalty case right now. I don't believe in the death penalty. Yeah, we're emotional beings, and like trying to think through that this truly is a world in which blame and reward and meritocracy, and none of that was earned, that is kind of a hard thing to do emotionally. It's hard to do that consistently. So like I try to save it for occasions where it really counts, and if I want to feel good about myself because somebody says like nice shirt, okay, whatever, I can go with that. That's okay that I don't like being true to my intellectual principles at that point.
When you were asked to contribute the essay to the book about something that you believe but you couldn't prove, I thought what you were going to say is human dignity, because for me, Robert, that's what you have. Is you have such a deep appreciation of the dignity of every human being, and I appreciate so much that for these people who have no one to stand by them, that you're showing up in those courthouses to do your best to try to help them. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you've learned in doing that. I mean, it's definitely beyond the call of duty of a professor to be going to these criminal court cases. And I wonder if you can talk about, how it's changed you.
Well, but at the same time, lest we get too congratulatory here about this, it's also fun. It's fun because as someone who is taught for years and years, well, this is an interesting set of 12 students. How do I do this most effectively? It's fun when a smart, acid-tongued prosecutor gets to cross-examine me, and we can spend an hour debating with each other, and, oh, that's kind of cool. Did I pull that off? And then it's cool when someone whose opinion matters to me as much as, say, yours, says something like, oh, you're a good guy for doing that. So much for the notion that's purely altruistic. Yeah, there's plenty of rewards coming from that. What I've mostly gotten out of it is this vast respect for public defenders, because each time I sit there with the one I worked with and said, okay, we lost another one. I've now lost, out of 11 out of 13 of these I've worked on. And they say, 2 wins out of 13. You're doing great. That's much better than we normally do. That is a calling that demands resilience and like responding to higher principles rather than being reinforced now and then. It's extraordinary. What I've come away with is just how terribly unfair this system is, because inevitably at some point I sit down with 500 pages of this guy's court records and medical records and counseling and this, and oh yeah, okay, so he was 8 when he was first sexually molested. Okay, so he was 11 when he first had his concussive head trauma. Okay, so he was abandoned at 3, substance abuser by the... And you just sit there and read them, and the world out there of people who were lost before they had the remotest chance of things working out okay, simply because this is a world filled with unspeakably bad luck for an awful lot of us, starting with every biological factor that we had no control over. Oh my God, this guy was lost before birth because his mother was abusing this substance, and thus he already was born with this part of the brain delayed in its development. No wonder 20 years later he's lousy at pulling off this emotional regulation. It's pretty
I think so many of the ideas are about those kinds of cases, and you're so right. I mean, the inequality in America is just getting worse and worse, and it's such a struggle for people just to be able to get by, and that's what I think I appreciate so much about this. I also wonder just about if this would look different in a different context. Like I think of just a society which doesn't run as reliably as what we're used to in North America, where you can't take for granted the rule of law. I mean, what does this look like this in another setting? And I wonder, you've certainly thought about that. I wonder if you have anything to say about it.
It's great that you draw on that, because we're living in the United States is like the poster child for individualistic mindsets, and as extreme of a belief in free will and agency, and we are the captains of our fates and all of that. So you go elsewhere and it's really quite different. As part of my science over the years, I spent about 30 years working on and off in East Africa and Kenya, and that's a very fatalistic world. The locusts come and eat your crops, and your kids are not going to survive the dry season. Or some totally brutal cop comes and takes your salary, because that's what the police do in that place. And it's much more of a world where things just happen, and it's much more fatalistic, and people I don't think sit around and have beliefs like every kid can grow up and become president. So if you don't, it's because somehow you didn't measure up. Yeah, it's a very different world elsewhere. We we sit in the corner of this planet where the most harm is done by the notion that we control our fates.
Yeah, that's so true. One of the things that I loved in Determined, like the little things are what I like the most about it. Like just discovering the little footnotes here and there. But one of the things that I liked was, as an offhand comment, you said that nearly every fact in the book had been discovered in the last 50 years, that half had been discovered in the last 5 years. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the scientific advances that have made it easier to believe in the idea that people don't have free will.
Well, a good way to appreciate that, and like that was not being hyperbolic on my part, there's an exponential increase in the number of scientific papers published each year and the number of people doing research, so that it quite literally is the case that 99% of what you learn in an introductory neuroscience class was found in the last 50 years and 75% in the last decade and all of that. But a much better way to appreciate it, I think, is to have like a historical perspective on where scientific insights have freed us from a notion of free will. And an example that always come to mind for me is like 500 years ago, someone like you or me, and we're both like sensible, reasonable people, and we want people to live like happy, fulfilled lives, and we understand the source of things, and we respect introspection and reflecting on things, all of that. And we would have been the same people then, and some horrendous hailstorm came completely out of nowhere, and both of us would have had a completely obvious attribution, which is the old lady with no teeth at the edge of the village who doesn't talk to anyone is the witch who caused it, and we need to act appropriately. And at some point, society figured out, like, oh, it doesn't work that way. And it took only about another 3 centuries for society to figure out, oh, epileptic seizures are not caused by Satan. They're caused by screwy potassium channels. And it took until, I don't know, the 1980s or so for people to realize, oh, mothers, because they are mothering in an unconsciously vicious way, do not cause schizophrenia. It's caused by a neurogenetic disorder of developmental abnormalities. And suddenly, the mothers of millions of people who had suffered from schizophrenia were told, it's not your fault, you didn't do it. And it took about another decade after that for people to begin to learn that, oh, that kid in your classroom who is not learning how to read is not lazy or unmotivated. There is a structural abnormality in like layer 4 of this part of the parietal cortex, and as a result, they reverse letters with closed loops, and they have dyslexia, and it's not their fault because it was a biology over which they had no control. And then, go another decade more recently, and you look at someone who is morbidly obese, and we all have our agency-laden attributions there. Come on, they've got to be able to show some self-discipline. Say no at one of these junctures, have 3 of these instead of 4 of these or whatever, and then we learn that, oh, there's variants of genes related to, say, the hormone leptin, and if you lucked out horribly and got one of these variants, there's absolutely nothing you could do about it. You were going to be obese, and you shouldn't go through your whole life hating yourself. And there's this thing called autism spectrum disorder, and you're not unlikable who repels people because you're a hateful person and you should hate yourself. There's something screwy with how you read social cues, and here's the neurobiology of it. And with each one of these steps, all we're doing is subtracting blame out of our understanding of the world. And not only doesn't the world fall apart once we figure out that some people had no control over this aspect of their personality or this aspect of their metabolism or some such thing, not only doesn't the world fall apart, it becomes more humane. I mean, it's a really good thing that we don't burn old ladies at the stake every time the weather does something unexpectedly damaging. All that science has done, and over in saying, actually, there was no agency there. That was not in their control. Let's make the world better.
Yeah, those are definitely the models. All those examples are very, in the forefront of my mind when I think about what the practical effects are of recognizing it. And philosophers like Immanuel Kant. I mean, he certainly felt like we have free will, but he felt like we had just a tiny bit of free will, and we would never know when we actually exercised it or not. It was because of all those factors that you described of just our own pride and lack of humility, etc. I've been thinking, there's so many people have been talking about artificial intelligence lately, and I know that you're there at Stanford often. Do you have anything to say or thoughts about people's worries about artificial intelligence, or the kinds of breakthroughs we've made? You may not even have tried it yet, but I've definitely fooled around a little bit with those programs, and they're interesting to me.
They're amazing, and I can't begin to tell you how uneducated I am about that entire subject. Our son is a machine learning CS Stanford grad, and you catch him on good days in terms of where this technology is going to take us and brain-machine interfaces and such, and he'll say things like, the first immortal person is already alive. And then you catch him on a bad day, where he'll say things like, 10, 20 years before the machines harvest us for our carbon. So, who knows? But I'm like, my wife had to teach me how to use a mouse on a computer, and I haven't gotten much more sophisticated since then. So I'm really not much of an AI pundit on this.
One of my favorite parts of Determined, and there's so much in there, but you have that footnote that's like right near the end, like a few pages from the very end, where you talk about just how cautious you need to be about being too self-congratulatory. I mean, it's about humility. It's just like that all of us need to realize that it's not that just we're smarter than everybody else or more brave than everybody else. And then you talk a little bit about just like your own struggles just with depression over time. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just what you see as like the relation between just kind of our general disposition and our kind of philosophy of life. I don't know if you have ideas about that, or if that's something that you think about. I think about William James, writing about that question.
Who struggled mightily with those issues, and would have benefited from pharmacology that was a century away from being invented for lessening some of his burdens. Well, one of the reasons why people recoil from the notion of there being no free will is that it's pretty demoralizing. It's potentially very depressing. There's no purpose. We're in this vast, indifferent universe. We're just a bunch of molecules, and I didn't earn any of the things I take pleasure in. Like, it was just sheer chance that I wound up lucking out and having somebody love me and all. Oh my God, this is so discouraging, all of that. And sort of, which is where I brought in that footnote of, I've kind of been struggling with depression for a long time, and it's kind of completely infiltrated my worldview. And if it turns out like that, our mitochondria are not our source of free will, bummer, how demoralizing is that? That's a piece of cake for me to deal with emotionally, compared with what a foul, negative state of mind I'm normally in. So I think I'm atypically good at distinguishing between there's free will, and it's a good thing that we all believe there is free will because of how destructive that could be otherwise. And one of the snarky, sarcastic things I do in the book is sort of analyzing a lot of contemporary philosophers who say all the right things. They say, yes, there's atoms. Yes, there's physical rules to the universe. Yes, our brains are made up of things that are squishy and biological. Yet somehow, here's where free will is still existing. And what I sort of point out is when you read these guys closely, an awful lot of the time what they're saying is it's going to be such a drag if there isn't free will that it's really just as well that we all believe in it.
Yeah. Well, I just think of just like famous historical people who either didn't believe in free will or believed that free will was just so curtailed. And I think of John Calvin in particular. I mean, for Calvin, it was impossible to believe that we would actually make a difference on anything, because that would impede God's ability to be in charge of everything. So there are definitely in Spinoza's philosophical and religious thought definitely was materialist and believed in God because God couldn't be hemmed in by human beings either. So yeah, there are people who kind of believe in a kind of source of meaning and who believe there's no free will, as well as people who are concerned that really undermines the human sense of self and human sense of being able to make a contribution.
Which brings us into the realm.
Do you read people like Immanuel, like Kant and Spinoza and Calvin? Like, how much did you study the history of that belief that there is no free will?
Well, I have I'm a science type rather than humanities, so I have very little ability to actually be able to do stuff like that. So, as a very self-serving rule, I decided I was not going to deal with any philosophers who had not heard of like action potentials and neurons, or like the function of the frontal cortex, which is to say, like 20th century or more recent philosophers. But that was my just cheating. I think I was mostly impressed with Spinoza getting excommunicated for his views about free will, because I had no idea that somebody Jewish could be excommunicated. That was a very exciting revelation for me.
Exactly. It seems one of the best things about being Jewish is to not be excommunicated.
Who would have thought Spinoza got himself excommunicated
Who would
by
have
a bunch of
thought?
yes, that even you can get in
Rabbis.
trouble in that
Yeah.
realm. So yeah, I'm very weak on the classic philosophers. I'm much more interested in the ones who can sit there and say, yes, there is a gene that's been identified that predisposes you towards antisocial violence if you were raised in an abusive childhood setting, and that quadruples your likelihood of winding up in front of a magistrate at some point. And here's
Hey,
somehow
Robert, you're
where
frozen.
we are still the masters of our own fates. Or here's somehow why it is still a just world in which we hold people responsible for our actions. So, I'm more interested in trying to take on philosophers like those, because they at least admit that they are functioning in this millennium.
So in Primate's memoir, I looked back. I enjoyed it so much when I read it, all those years ago. But you have a dream where you imagine that all the angels are all real in the middle of the night. And I wonder if you ever have this idea that God is that source of all the things that are already determined, or if that's just like completely doesn't even occur to you because you're thinking along other lines.
Well, unfortunately, in my waking hours, I can't think that way and I can't feel that way. And I'm one of the most unspiritual people you can ever find, which is too bad, because I think I'd be in a lot better place in life if I were capable of all that. But I'm simply not. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked since I was 14. But in terms of, is there a blueprint anywhere, and thus is there a blueprint maker? And you're bringing in Calvin. I think there's an important distinction between a contemporary sense of determinism and a Calvinist sense of predeterminism, which the latter is much more about whatever you do, you were fated to do, and there's nothing that could be done. And a sort of contemporary scientific determinism, where people like me who believe in it get conniptions, is when somebody says, oh, are you saying that nothing can change? Don't bother, nothing can change because everything is determined, which is as far from the case as possible, because change happens. And people change in ways that are unbelievably wonderful or awful, and societies change, and change happens. And where the determinism comes in is people's belief that when they suddenly stop being a white supremacist and regret everything they did and have this revelation and are soon embracing the people whose lives they were like torturing beforehand, that they chose to have this transformation occur. No, they didn't choose it. Circumstances brought them to that moment such that some other circumstances were able to catalyze that insight on their part, that transformation. Like, we are changed dramatically, and often the ways in which we are changed makes it easier for us to then put ourselves in positions that will reify that change even further. But we are not choosing the change in that circumstance. You know, an example of this, somebody watches some incredibly inspiring movie about someone, what was it, the conscientious objector who went and saved like 40 guys in some World War II battle, and or the guy in Rwanda, the hotel manager, who saved 1,000 people during the genocide there, and was in the movie pictured in the Hotel Rwanda. And, you know, someone will come out of that and say, oh my God, I'm so moved by that, and I think I'm going to do something. I'm going to go volunteer for Amnesty International. Their behavior just changed. And somebody else will come out of it and say, oh my God, that was the most amazing cinematography in that movie. I'm going to go study like the works of that cinematographer. Or somebody else will come out and say, oh my God, that was so emotionally manipulative and cheesy. I can't believe I wasted my money. How did those three different people wind up the way they... There's nothing that went into the person who the next day, you know, Googles Amnesty International that had anything to do with them being an agent of change. Circumstances just made them the sort of person where that would have that effect on them, and thus bring about that change in them.
Yeah, and I guess for me, it's just, you know, whether it's deterministic, if that happens in a deterministic way, or we live in a deterministic universe, and you can't know whether it's deterministic or not, then, you know, just it's helpful, like, from the pragmatic perspective of, like I say, not condemning the person who's, you know, on death row, or you know, who's all those examples that you gave earlier. You know, that's helpful for me. But it's one of those things that can't be firmly established for me. You know, one of the things I think about too is, I don't know if you ever read George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's book, Metaphors We Live By. It was an interesting book from the 80s or 70s or whatever. But I mean, I wanted to point out just that, you know, so they talk about just how when you like look at argument, one of the examples they use is argument is war. So use all these like shot down his arguments and all these militaristic ways of describing what an argument is. And if you described it as argument as dance, you'd have a different perspective on things. But you know, that metaphor of human beings as machine, I wonder if you've thought about just like other metaphors for what it means to be human, and how those metaphors just kind of influence, you know, what you think is possible in terms of your arguments, and even just your background as an evolutionary biologist is going to kind of predispose you to certain perspectives on things. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the metaphors and the worldviews that influence you.
Well, machine is as in your face as I could get, and some of that is just sort of macho. This is, yeah, we're just machines. A much better way of just saying it is like all of us are just outcomes. All of our foibles and quirks and weaknesses are just the outcome of stuff we had no control over. So that's perhaps a much more palatable way of saying that. Or we're a complicated, troubled species, and it's no surprise that we do mutually contradictory things that are self-defeating left and right, and have astonishing capacities for good acts that are astonishingly restricted only to certain types of people, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, there's ways of reframing all of these. But yes, the notion, I love Lakoff's point in terms of how powerful metaphors can be. Um, like, we will kill people for metaphors. We will
That's
kill
true.
people in battle over who has grabbed the flag of their company's colors, because that's symbolic of all they hold near and dear in their Civil War ideology, and they would then get shot because of the
Yeah.
metaphor they were carrying. Or somebody wears the wrong color sneakers in, I don't know, Compton in LA with the wrong gang connotations, or somebody is willing to give up their life protecting someone because they have some metaphorical symbols that they're one of us. They're one of us. Metaphors really have very powerful effects on us.
Robert, I think you probably remember from when you were here last time that we take questions from our audience. So we've been getting tons of questions. I feel guilty for not starting this earlier, but so we've got a number of questions. The first one is address free won't, the idea that we can control our list of things we won't do, such as by associating the behavior with disgust or shame.
Great. Well, in a
Free
formal
won't.
sense, free won't is okay, you may not be able to prevent your urges, your proclivities, the starts of what you were doing, but you can intercept them in the last moment with volitional inhibition, that you could free won't the system. And, from a biological standpoint, free won't and free will are exactly the same thing. You just like switch one of the plus signs to a negative in your circuitry or whatever, and you've now switched from how do you activate something to how do you inactivate it, or how do you activate something by inhibiting the inhibitor. And it's, free won't as a conceptual process is no different from free will, and just as sort of subject to things. Nonetheless, we have a tremendous amount of respect for the moments where we show self-control and where we show doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do and things of that sort. But, inspiring though that may be, it's made of the same biological stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I just having read your book, I knew how to answer the question. Okay, here's another question. Given that as individuals we do not have free will and that we are bounded and directed by our biology, can a social group overcome the boundaries of its members? Can group intelligence allow us to overcome our biological limitations?
Which is great. Yes, because stuff emerges from groups. With the right group dealing with the right question, you could get more wisdom in decision making that any expert on their own could do. Wisdom of the crowd phenomenon. On the other hand, in groups, you could get people doing appalling things out of anonymity and the emotional contagion of a group that produces like individual behaviors that somebody would never have thought they were capable of. Yeah, groups are different from individuals. Ooh, I have a dog leaning against my face right now. Again, I don't know if this is visual or if it's just audio, but I've got two dogs that I'm trying to contain here. Yeah, groups can bring out the best of us and can bring out the worst. And all we have to do is look at the last 3.5 years and see like people, first responders and all of that, who were beyond noble and inspiring of what they were willing to do for the greater good, the good of the group. And then you saw all the people who refused to wear masks and refused to vaccinate and refused to care about anybody else's well-being. Yeah, groups bring out interesting stuff in us. I think it was Reinhold Niebuhr who said something to the effect of, there's nothing more dangerous than a group of people. And
Yeah, well,
that's
basically,
true, but on one... What's that?
His book,
one for
one of his most
optimism.
famous books was Moral Man, Immoral Society, which kind of gives you a sense for where he stands on it all.
Exactly, that
Uh,
concept. But every now and then the group does something more wonderful than individuals will do. And so, every now and then there's ground for optimism.
so here's another question. So how do we, this is from one of our viewers. So how do you build a society that can accommodate all these lost people? Or are they part of the 11 out of 13 for whom your courtroom testimony is not sufficient to sway a jury? How do you treat a lost person with kindness?
Well, I think the most important thing, you know, what do you do with the fact that science leads you to the point that you really shouldn't cause damaging, violent people to be blamed as if they were responsible for their actions and feel as if they are deserving of punishment? And then there's another big challenge to look at people who've done wonderfully altruistic, artistic, whatever things, and feel as if they deserve no extra treatment because they didn't earn those traits. And to get past that. But the really tough one is like to sit there and hope somebody doesn't sit down at the same table as you because they've got really off-putting personality traits or something. And knowing that they really didn't have anything to do with it. And they have suffered for those traits much more than you have for the ways in which they're like exasperating to be around. Yeah, it requires, like, even in those moments, they became the way they are through no control and are as deserving of being viewed as not agents in whatever crazy making traits they have that have made them as such lonely or marginalized or friendless or unloved or whatever. Yeah, in a lot of ways, just as it's mammothly difficult to decide an appalling mass murderer is only the outcome of what they couldn't control, and this wonderful Nobel Peace Prize winner is no more than that. Like, our every day-to-day challenges are to have that apply to how we interact with someone who we wouldn't immediately warm up to, or someone who unfairly we immediately warm up to because of all these sorts of traits that just appeal to our irrationalities. Yeah, they're better looking than the other person. Yeah, they don't have a scrapey, irritating voice. Yeah, to turn that into everyday actions. It's not just how we make sense of Stalin or make sense of Gandhi. It's also how we make sense of just, our everyday interactions and having to remind ourselves that none of us are responsible for who we became.
Yeah. We have one more question. As you said that, I do think, I think of Kant talking about just being amazed at the two things that fill him with awe are the starry heavens above him and the moral law within him. And I mean, you don't believe in the moral law within us, but you definitely appreciate the dignity of human beings. And that's the tough part, I think, I think that's why it's hard for you to hold on to these two different ideas at once, that kind of, we don't have free will, and that every person has this very deep sense that they're a deep dignity, a deep worth or value. Just as somebody looking in from the outside, I see those two things as being kind of a little bit of a struggle. But we have one more question from one of our audience members, and we only have 1 minute left. And the question is, how do you explain someone who has made roughly the same decision differently on two different occasions? For example, a student who does not work to his full potential in as fast as one semester, and then spends more time partying, and then the next semester decides to put more effort into his work and thus performs better. That's the
Because
question.
the two situations are not the same. Just to cite a study that I love, you take somebody and they will give you different answers to a questionnaire about their social political views if they're sitting in a room that smells of rotten garbage, or if they're sitting in a room that smells of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, because their brain works differently. So you're not in the same situation in those two cases.
Yeah, that's what I keep thinking. I'll tell you, you did a good job of teaching me, Robert. I enjoyed reading your book very much. It's such a pleasure to talk to you again. I just really appreciate that there are Robert Sapolskys out in the world doing their best to like affirm the dignity of every person, and doing it not just in a theoretical way, but are on the front lines, going to the courtrooms and trying to put your life on the line for these ideas. What a pleasure it's been to spend this time with you as you drive across the country.
But don't forget, I have fun arguing with the prosecutors, so altruism is a very softball concept, but thank you. And thank you. Words like that coming from you mean a lot.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to seeing you back in person when you're back home here in San Francisco. And I wish you all the best as you travel. And for all those who are watching us, please join us on Sunday at 9:30 a.m. in person. Our guest will be Pamela Cooper White. We'll be talking about her book, The Psychology of Christian Nationalism, Why People Are Drawn In, and How to Talk Across the Divide. Pamela also will preach at our 11 o'clock choral Eucharist service. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word WONDER, WONDER, to 76278. That's 76278. And again, I encourage everybody to read Determined. It's a fascinating look at what it means to be human. And thanks again to Robert Sapolsky. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. And it's always like pleasure is a superficial word for it. So thank you.